a beauty queen, a brutal regime, and a message so powerful it made the entire world stop and listen. Venezuela just dropped a truth bomb about Filipinos that nobody saw coming, and trust me, this isn't your typical feel-good international friendship story. What happened behind those cameras will make you question everything you thought you knew about sacrifice, courage, and what it really means to stand up when the whole world is watching. Buckle up. This gets wild. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. Okay, so let me set the scene for you. January 3rd, 2026. Early morning. Caracas, Venezuela. Explosions tearing through the darkness. Military helicopters circling like vultures. And while most of the world was still shaking off their New Year's hangovers, 74 Filipinos woke up to what can only be described as a geopolitical nightmare on steroids. Here's where it gets absolutely insane. The United States, yes. The United States launched a full-scale military operation on Venezuelan soil. Codename Operation Absolute President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Filipinos. Within hours, they were handcuffed and right? But here's the kicker that nobody saw coming, and this is where our story really begins. While the entire world was losing its collective mind over this unprecedented move, while the UN Secretary General was issuing warnings about dangerous precedents, while Russia and China were screaming about violations of international law, and while oil markets were doing that nervous twitching thing they do when chaos erupts, the Philippines did something that made everyone pause. Something that said more about courage, principle, and what it means to stand for something when the stakes are life and death than any military flexing ever could. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you the full picture first. Because what Venezuela just said about Filipinos and what those 74 ordinary people caught in the crossfire represent is going to hit you right in the chest. And trust me, you're not ready for where this story goes. Picture this. You're one of those 74 Filipinos. Maybe you're a nurse in a Caracas hospital. Maybe you're working in hospitality, sending money back home to your family in Mindanao or Luzon. Maybe you're an engineer helping rebuild infrastructure in a country that's been economically devastated for years. You're just trying to make an honest living, right? Just trying to survive in a nation where oil reserves the largest on planet Earth at 303 billion barrels, bigger than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion, couldn't stop an economy from imploding. And then, boom, literally, you wake up to explosions, low-flying aircraft. The sound of warfare that you thought you'd escaped when you left home. Your phone is blowing up not with New Year wishes, but with frantic messages from loved ones asking if you're alive. The Philippine Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, because Venezuela doesn't even have a resident Philippine embassy. That's how far from home you are, is sending out emergency advisories telling you to stay indoors, identify safe spaces, keep your head down. And here's what absolutely guts me about these 74 people. According to Philippine Chargé d'Affaires Judy Razon, who gave an interview on January 6, 2026, every single one of them remained calm, not panicking, not losing their minds, just quietly helping each other, checking in on one another, staying connected to the embassy. That's the Filipino spirit right there, grace under pressure that would make anyone else crumble. But here's my question for you, and I really want you to drop your answer in the comments. If you woke up tomorrow in a war zone, thousands of miles from home, would you keep your composure like these 74 Filipinos did, or would you lose it completely? Be honest. I'll read every comment. Now, let's talk about what Venezuela represents in this chess game, because understanding this is understanding why what the Philippines said matters so damn much. Venezuela holds 1/5 of the world's proven oil reserves. That's not a typo, 1/5. And yet, their oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1997 to just 934,000 barrels per day by November 2025. That's less than 1% of global demand. How do you have the most oil on Earth and still end up with 94% of your population living in poverty? That's what sanctions, corruption, and economic mismanagement look like when they have a toxic threesome. But here's where it gets really interesting and deeply uncomfortable. President Trump, in his press conference after the operation, barely mentioned the drug trafficking charges that supposedly justified this whole invasion. You know what he did talk about extensively? Venezuela's oil, taking control of those reserves, making Venezuela pay back stolen oil. He literally said the US would run Venezuela until a transition could happen. And multiple sources, including business analysts and the CSIS think tank, have been openly speculating about the future of Venezuela's oil industry like they're discussing a corporate takeover, not a sovereign nation's resources. Oil. It always comes back to oil, doesn't it? The black gold that makes nations into puppets and turns international law into suggestions. 8 million Venezuelans have fled their country since 2014. That's the largest displacement crisis in Latin American history. Families torn apart, dreams destroyed. People leaving behind everything they knew for a chance, just a chance at survival elsewhere. And now, with Maduro removed, but his entire government infrastructure still in place, with Trump's administration talking about running Venezuela like it's a subsidiary company, those 8 million people are caught between impossible hope and crushing skepticism. Can you imagine? Leaving your homeland, watching it fall apart from afar, getting that tiny flicker of hope that maybe things could change, and then watching the superpower that removed your dictator start treating your country like a business acquisition? That's the emotional whiplash Venezuelans are experiencing right now. That's the trauma layered upon trauma that makes this so much more than a military operation. And those 74 Filipinos, they're witnessing all of this firsthand, living through it, breathing the same air as people whose entire reality just got shattered and reassembled in less than 24 hours. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody anticipated. Because while powerful nations were either celebrating this operation or condemning it based on their own political agendas, while China was suspiciously quiet, probably taking notes for Taiwan, if we're being real, while Russia was screaming bloody murder, and while most of America's allies were, well, awkwardly silent. The Philippines, this archipelagic nation of 115 million people, this country that has its own battles with territorial disputes in the South China Sea, this nation that relies on the US as its primary defense ally, stepped forward and said something that made the entire world sit up and pay attention. And what they said? What they said wasn't just about those 74 Filipinos. It was about every Filipino, every person who's ever felt powerless against forces bigger than themselves, every nation that's ever been told to sit down and shut up while the powerful do whatever they want. What Venezuela just heard from the Philippines about these 74 people and what it means for the rest of us is going to blow your mind. But first, you need to understand the real stakes here. So here's what the Philippines said, and I need you to really hear this, because it's the kind of statement that historians are going to be dissecting for decades. On January 5th, 2026, just 48 hours after the explosions stopped echoing through Caracas, the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs released a statement. Not a tweet, not a casual remark. A formal diplomatic statement that basically said, "Hold up, we see you and we have some concerns." Listen to these exact words, and I'm paraphrasing for clarity, but keeping the essence. The Philippines views with concern the evolving events in Venezuela and their consequential impact on peace and stability in the region, as well as on the rules-based international order, they continued. While acknowledging the United States' underlying security considerations, the Philippines stresses the relevant principles of international law, including the independence and sovereign equality of states, the peaceful resolution of disputes, the prohibition against the threat or use of force, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. Do you understand what just happened there? A nation of 115 million people, a country that depends on the United States for defense cooperation, a country that has the Mutual Defense Treaty signed back in 1951, a country that's literally getting bullied by China in the South China Sea as we speak, just looked at its primary military ally and said, yeah, no, this ain't it. The Philippines didn't scream, didn't throw a tantrum, didn't burn flags or stage protests at the US Embassy. Okay, some militant groups did, but that's different. The government simply, calmly, firmly invoked international law. They reminded the world, and especially their powerful ally, that principles matter, that sovereignty matters, that you can't just do whatever you want because you're the biggest kid on the playground. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the Philippines isn't speaking from some position of moral superiority or safety. They're speaking from a place of lived experience. Right now, in January 2026, Chinese Coast Guard vessels are ramming Philippine boats. Water cannons are being fired at Filipino fishermen trying to make a living in their own exclusive economic zone. In December 2025, 3 Filipino fishermen were injured when Chinese ships attacked near Sabina Shoal. Just weeks before that, China announced they're establishing a national nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal, which is 124 nautical miles from the Philippine coast and well within Philippine waters, according to the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling. You know what China did with that ruling? The one that definitively said their 9-9 plan was illegal? They used it as toilet paper, literally rejected it, and kept doing whatever they wanted. So when the Philippines stands up and says, hey, international law matters, sovereign equality matters, you can't just use force to get what you want, they're not being hypocritical. They're not playing politics. They're speaking as a nation that knows what it feels like when a more powerful country just ignores your rights and does whatever benefits them. Here's my question, and I need you to sound off in the comments. Do you think the Philippines was right to call out the US on this, or should they have just stayed quiet to keep their ally happy? Because this is the exact dilemma that small nations face every single day. Drop your honest take below. I'm reading all of them. But wait, it gets even more layered. Because here's the delicious irony that nobody's talking about. The Philippines has been screaming for years that the world needs to uphold the rules-based international order against China's aggression. They've been citing international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the 2016 ruling basically every legal document that exists to fight back against Chinese encroachment. And you know who's been backing them up? The United States. Washington has been vocally supporting the Philippines, conducting joint military exercises, expanding defense cooperation under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and constantly emphasizing the importance of, wait for it, the rules-based international order. Fast forward to January 2026, and suddenly the rules-based international order looks more like the rules BASED on whoever has the biggest guns order. Legal experts from organizations like the International Association of Democratic Lawyers are calling the Venezuela operation imperialist aggression. Human rights lawyer Edre Olalia, who's Filipino by the way, wrote on Facebook, "This is not only outrageous but shameless arrogance that does not appear to have any valid legal basis nor justification. It can only be seen as imperialist aggression and overreach, to have global domination and driven by greed over Venezuela's oil." The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued warnings about dangerous precedents. And here's where the Philippines statement becomes absolutely prophetic, because if you let this slide, if you let a superpower invade another country, kidnap its president, and announce plans to run that country and seize its oil reserves, what's to stop other powerful nations from doing the same? Experts are already connecting the dots. William Yang from the International Crisis Group told Reuters, "Washington's consistent. Long-standing arguments are always that the Chinese actions are violating international law, but they are now damaging that." Translation? China's been watching, and now they have a perfect precedent for Taiwan, for the South China Sea, for anywhere they want to flex their muscles. The United States just handed them a gift-wrapped justification. Well, you did it in Venezuela, so why can't we? This is the nightmare scenario that keeps Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. up at night. Because his country is preparing to chair ASEAN in 2026, trying to negotiate a code of conduct with China for the South China Sea, attempting to convince the world that international law matters, and then his primary ally goes and does this. Now think about those 74 Filipinos again. They're not politicians, they're not diplomats, they're nurses, engineers, teachers, hospitality workers. People who left their families to earn money abroad because the Philippines, despite its beauty and potential, still struggles with poverty and limited opportunities. These 74 people represent the 10 million overseas Filipino workers scattered across the globe. They're in Saudi Arabia caring for elderly patients. They're on ships sailing international waters. They're in New York working as nurses during pandemics. They're the backbone of the Philippine economy, sending back $37 billion in remittances in 2024 alone. And when chaos erupts, when superpowers play their games and people get caught in the crossfire, it's people like these 74 who suffer, not the politicians making decisions from comfortable offices. Not the military brass planning operations from air-conditioned war rooms, the everyday people just trying to survive. But here's what Venezuela and the entire world is learning about Filipinos through this crisis. Here's what that statement from the DFA, here's what the calm resilience of those 74 people, here's what the moral courage to call out even your closest ally reveals. Filipinos understand something that powerful nations often forget. They understand it in their bones because they've lived it for centuries, colonized by Spain for 333 years, by America for 48 years, occupied by Japan during World War II, and now being harassed by China in their own waters. They understand that principles aren't just pretty words you say when it's convenient. That human dignity isn't negotiable based on power dynamics. That standing up for what's right sometimes means standing alone, or at least feeling alone, even when the cost could be devastating. Those 74 Filipinos didn't panic, didn't demand military extraction, didn't cry for special treatment. They checked on each other, stayed in contact with their embassy, and endured. Because that's what Filipinos do. That's what centuries of being told you're not important enough, not powerful enough, not wealthy enough has taught them that your worth isn't determined by what others say about you. It's determined by how you carry yourself when everything is falling apart. And what the Philippines just told Venezuela, what they told the entire world is about to change everything. But the cost of that courage, the real price they might pay for speaking truth to power, that's the part that'll haunt you. Let me tell you what the Philippines just risked. And I mean everything. The Mutual Defense Treaty, signed August 30th, 1951. That's 74 years of alliance with the United States. That's 7 decades of joint military exercises, defense cooperation, security guarantees, and the promise that if the Philippines gets attacked, America has their back. That treaty is the only thing standing between China's 9-dash-line ambitions and the complete erasure of Philippine sovereignty in the South China Sea. And on January 5th, 2026, with Chinese Coast Guard vessels literally ramming their boats, with water cannons injuring Filipino fishermen, with Beijing declaring nature reserves on Philippine waters, Manila looked at their most powerful ally and said, "This isn't right. Do you understand the guts that takes, the sheer, bone-deep courage? Former Senator Leila de Lima, who served as Justice Secretary and knows a thing or two about standing up to power, called it exactly what it is. This serves as a reality check on our reliance on the United States for moral leadership on the world stage and as an ally for regional security and a rules-based international order. She continued with words that should echo in every history book. As a U.S. ally, this leaves the Philippines with a compromised moral ascendancy in protesting, condemning, opposing, and fighting China's aggression in the West Philippine Sea. This is due to the fact that our major ally against Chinese aggression uses that same aggression against a smaller neighbor like what the Philippines is to China. Read that again. The Philippines just pointed out that their protector is now doing to Venezuela exactly what China is doing to them. The cognitive dissonance, the moral betrayal, the sheer hypocrisy of it all. Here's the thing that'll make you want to scream. Just months ago, the U.S. Senate passed Resolution 409, celebrating the 74th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It explicitly condemned China's unprovoked aggression and political lawfare in the South China Sea. It reaffirmed that the treaty extends to armed attacks on Philippine forces anywhere in the South China Sea. It praised the Philippines for resisting Chinese coercion. The resolution literally states, the United States and the Philippines are bound by a deep and abiding friendship, forged by a history of shared sacrifice and common purpose. Shared sacrifice, common purpose. Rules-based international order. And then, 3 months later, Venezuela happens. Stop right here. I need you to answer this honestly in the comments. If you were a Philippine government official right now, watching China bully your fishermen while your main ally just invaded another country, what would you do? Stay silent and hope for protection? Speak up and risk losing that protection? This is the impossible choice small nations face. Tell me, what would you do? The Federation of Free Workers, a Filipino labor group, put it in terms so simple a child could understand. We cannot credibly oppose China's bullying and coercion in the West Philippine Sea while excusing or normalizing violations of international law by the US or other superpowers elsewhere. Selective outrage is not a principle, it is a precedent, and precedents are exactly what bullies weaponize. They said it in Tagalog too, sa West Philippine Sea, ang sandata natin ay batas hindi armas, kaya dapat pareho ang sukatan, bawal ang pambubully, kahit sino pa ang gumagawa. Translation: in the West Philippine Sea, our weapon is the law, not arms. So the standard must be the same. Bullying is forbidden, whoever does it. LAW. Not weapons. Not military might. Not superpowers doing whatever they want because they can. LAW. That's what those 74 Filipinos in Venezuela represent. That's what the Philippine government statement represents. That's what centuries of colonization, occupation, and being told you don't matter has taught the Filipino people, that when you have no military power, no economic leverage, no nuclear weapons, your only weapon is principle. Your only defense is international law. Your only hope is that the world will care about justice more than power. And now, that weapon just got weaker. That defense just got compromised. That hope just took a devastating blow. Because if the United States, the country that writes strongly worded statements condemning Chinese aggression, the country that promises to defend the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Treaty, the country that constantly invokes international law and the rules-based order, if that country can invade Venezuela, kidnap its president, and announce plans to seize its oil, what's to stop China from doing the same to Taiwan, to the Philippines, to anyone? Beijing is watching, and they're taking notes, and every analyst worth their salt is saying the exact same thing. The US just handed China a gift-wrapped precedent. You know what keeps me up at night about this story? It's not the geopolitics, it's not the oil, it's not even the precedent. It's those 74 Filipinos. They're still there, still in Venezuela, still going to work, still sending money home, still checking in with each other, still embodying that quiet resilience that Filipinos have perfected over centuries. And they watch their government, their small, struggling, bullied by China government, stand up for what's right, even when it could cost them everything. Even when their most powerful ally might be offended. Even when the safer, easier, more pragmatic choice would have been silent. This is what Venezuela learned about Filipinos. This is what the world learned. That there are still people, still nations who believe that principles matter more than power. That dignity isn't negotiable. That standing up for what's right isn't a calculation based on whether you'll win, but a choice based on who you are. Those 74 Filipinos didn't ask for their government to risk the US alliance. They probably would have been fine with silence. Survival is enough of a goal when you're caught in a war zone. But their government looked at those 74 people and saw something bigger than just expatriate workers. They saw 10 million overseas Filipino workers scattered across the globe. They saw every Filipino who's ever been told they're too small, too poor, too powerless to matter. They saw centuries of being colonized, occupied, and dismissed. They saw a future where their children might face the same choice. Stay silent and survive, or speak up and possibly lose everything. And here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to hear. The Philippines might have just destroyed their own leverage. China could get more aggressive knowing the US-Philippine alliance is strained. The Mutual Defense Treaty might mean less if Washington feels insulted. Those 74 Filipinos and millions more might be less safe because their government chose principle over pragmatism. But you know what? That's what courage looks like. Real courage isn't about winning. It's not about calculating odds and making the safe bet. Real courage is looking at an impossible situation and choosing to do what's right anyway. Knowing you might lose. Knowing it might cost you everything. Doing it anyway. Because here's what Venezuela and the entire watching world just learned about Filipinos. They've been colonized by Spain for 333 years, occupied by America, invaded by Japan, bullied by China, scattered across the globe in search of better opportunities. Told over and over that they don't matter, that they're too small, too poor, too powerless to have a voice. And yet, when the moment came, when the choice was between safety and principle, between pragmatism and courage, between staying silent and speaking truth to power, even when that power is your own protector, they chose to stand. Not with weapons, not with military might, not with economic leverage, with words, with principles, with the simple, devastating statement, international law matters, sovereign equality matters. You cannot use force to get what you want. Even if you're our ally, even if we need you, even if it costs us everything. Those 74 Filipinos in Venezuela, they're safe. No one was hurt. They're checking in with each other, staying connected to their embassy, enduring with that signature Filipino grace. But what they represent, what their government statement represents, is so much bigger than their individual safety. It's every person who's ever felt powerless standing up anyway. It's every nation that's been told to know their place, finally refusing. It's every moment in history when someone chose principle over survival and changed the world by doing it. The Philippines just told Venezuela and China and Russia and every superpower watching that dignity isn't for sale. That some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter who's crossing them. That law matters more than might, even when you're the one with no might to speak of. And maybe they'll pay for it. Maybe China will get bolder. Maybe the US will be less reliable. Maybe those 74 Filipinos will become 7,400 caught in other conflicts as the world slides back into might makes right. But history will remember that when it mattered, the Philippines stood up. Not because they could win, but because it was right. So hit that like button if this story hit you in the chest like it hit me. Share it if you think more people need to understand what real courage looks like. And drop a comment telling me, would you make the same choice? Would you risk everything to stand for principle? Because that's not a hypothetical anymore. That's the world we're living in right now. And the answer you give, that's who you are. The world is watching. What Venezuela learned about Filipinos is this. Some people still believe in something bigger than survival. And that's what changes everything.